just
I want to start with the senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, who was a major power in the U.S. Senate in the 1850s. He's somebody that everybody in the 1850s expected is going to be a president someday. So he's a powerful Democratic senator from Illinois. The problem...
From America's Newsroom, I'm Harris Faulkner. A former CIA operative suing the one-time number 2
was westward expansion. Douglas was not thinking the slavery issue so much as he was thinking about the issue of westward expansion. And people have talked about Douglas being of this generation that was called the Young Americans, the generation that sort of flourished during the war with Mexico, when a great deal of territories, the Utah, New Mexico territory, and California, had been acquired during that period. One of the things that Douglas prized was that the greatness of the United States was in its expansion westward. The problem by 1853, 1854, that U.S. westward expansion faces is this chunk up there called the unorganized territory. That's the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase. And under the Missouri Compromise of 1820, can slavery go there?
No.
No. Slavery is prohibited in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase in this thing that's called unorganized territory. Douglas wants to organize it. He wants to establish a territorial government there. Some people say it's because he's got interest in a westward railroad, a transcontinental railroad that would go through there. I would argue it has a lot to do with his sense that westward expansion and settlement is important to the destiny of the United States. There are also people out there, west of Missouri, west of Iowa, very small numbers of people, but there are Iowans and Missourians who want to move into that territory but doesn't have a government. Unorganized means it has no territorial government. So Douglas has been trying, and in fact the senator from Iowa has been trying, to organize, give a territorial government to this unorganized territory. But Douglas and other people who want to organize that territory can't get any help because they can't get Southern votes in Congress. It is not in the interest of Southerners to organize what are going to become more free states that will vote for Northern interests and not Southern interests. So to get cooperation from the Southerners, and one of the principal people that Douglas is dealing with is the senator from Missouri, David Atchison. To get cooperation from the Southerners to get a bill to organize this territory, Douglas has to remove the prohibition on slavery. And so this is what 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act does. And in fact, Kansas-Nebraska, this piece of legislation, does two things. First of all, it organizes the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Go to the next map. So that unorganized territory becomes Nebraska territory and Kansas territory. Gives them territorial governments. But the second and much, much more controversial thing that the Kansas-Nebraska legislation does in 1854 is it removes the Missouri Compromise prohibition on slavery and replaces it with something called popular sovereignty. Now, popular sovereignty, Douglas will eventually argue that popular sovereignty goes back to the Revolution. Popular sovereignty means let the people rule. This is a very simple, fundamental American principle. Douglas would say the fundamental principle of American democracy. Let the people rule. What it means in the context of Kansas and Nebraska territories is that rather than Congress having said this is going to have slavery or not going to have slavery, popular sovereignty says that the settlers get to decide whether or not there will be slavery. And for Douglas, this is the ultimate morality. Democracy is the fundamental moral principle of the United States. What the people decide is the ultimate morality. Now, this is where Douglas does not understand morality as other people see it. Because when the Missouri Compromise restriction is repealed, you will have many Northerners who are outraged that slavery, once forbidden in this region, is now allowed to go there. And some of those Northerners are going to be outraged on moral grounds because they say slavery is immoral and it should not be expanded. This will be the fundamental argument of an Abraham Lincoln. Slavery is immoral, it is morally wrong, it is an evil, it should not be expanded. Now there are going to be other Northerners who are just going to be upset because they wanted to go out and settle in Kansas and start farms, and they didn't want to compete with planters coming with their slaves and starting farms. But for Douglas, the ultimate morality was to let the people decide, to subject it to the decision at the ballot box. The North, although Kansas-Nebraska was very controversial, although there were people who were outraged at people like Abraham Lincoln who were outraged at the sort of fundamental immorality of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a large part of the North, I would argue, sort of accepted the premise. And this, in fact, in the Senate, William Henry Seward says, all right, you of the slave states, we in the North take up your challenge to populate Kansas and to win this race at the ballot box. And I'm badly paraphrasing his words, but a lot of Northerners, the gauntlet had been thrown down. They took up this challenge. They had to win Kansas demographically. They had to get there in numbers, and they had to organize, and they had to vote. So here we go to the migration patterns. This is from the territorial census of 1855. Because Kansas Territory is right on the border with Missouri, not too surprising, the bulk of the settlers in Kansas Territory come from Missouri. The North, and by North, we're really talking Midwest. I've left New Englanders out. Settlers from the North are about a third. And these settlers, these are Hoosiers. These are people from Illinois. These are Buckeyes. These are people from the Midwest who are moving out. Other Southerners from other parts of the South except for Missouri, really minor, 7%. The New Englanders, who are going to get a lot of attention in the Missouri and Southern press, are an even more minuscule number of about 4%. You hear a lot about the New Englanders when you go out to Lawrence, when you go to the museum in Topeka. You probably get a lot about the New Englanders. There aren't very many of them. But they were the ones who tended to write a lot about their experience in Kansas, and because the Missourians were particularly surprised, nobody expected people to come all the way from Connecticut or Massachusetts out to Kansas. So this got a lot of attention from the Southerners and got overblown. So when you read accounts of all of the northern settlers in Kansas are from New England, but they're not. They're a very small percentage. Northern settlers mostly come from Midwestern states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. And then there are about 10% of foreign-born residents in Kansas, or babies that are actually listed, their birthplace is Kansas Territory. What's crucial here, this census was taken in anticipation of an election. March 30th of 1855 is to be the election of the territorial legislature. for Kansas. And this is going to be an important turning point, because whether or not we have slavery in Kansas Territory depends on who gets elected, what the voters decide. That's what popular sovereignty has said. So this territorial census is done in anticipation of an upcoming election in March of 1855. It will be the election that will select the territorial legislature. The territorial census, in addition, we can look at it and we can see where people had come from. But the territorial census also gives us some numbers. It tells us that there are about 8,000 people in Kansas Territory by the March 1855 election. It tells us that of those 8,000 or so people, 2,905 of them are adult white males eligible to vote in the upcoming election. So we got 2,905 voters in Kansas Territory coming into the 1855 election. The election is held. Certain candidates are pro-slavery candidates. Certain candidates are known to support making Kansas a free state. We have 2,905 voters. The pro-slavery candidates win, racking up majorities in the neighborhood of 5,000 or 6,000 votes. So something has gone terribly wrong with popular sovereignty. Douglas's great solution here. We've got twice as many votes being registered as there are voters in the territory. And this is what happened, pretty much. The so-called border ruffians, as the Northerners will begin to call these Missourians. People came over from Missouri on election day who had not been counted in the census because they were not living in the territory, and they voted. And in fact, many of them, if you believe the stories, voted more than once. And this is a drawing actually from a later election, about 1857, but it shows what the northern settlers in Kansas say is going on in the spring of 1855, which is people lined up and they voted, and then they went over and they got a drink, and then they got back in line to vote, and you see them changing hats. I mean, this is the way you sort of changed your identity to vote again. You swapped coats with someone or swapped hats, and then you went back up and you voted again. The Missourians would say that if they committed fraud, they didn't do anything. You find this in testimony the Missourians give to the Congressional Investigating Committee a year later. Missourians said, well, we didn't do anything in Kansas Territory that we didn't do back in Kentucky, or that we don't do in Missouri. I mean, you always vote more than once at elections. And the Northerners are all irate because they say that on election day that the Missourians came over armed and they brandished their guns and their Bowie knives and they intimidated Northern voters into not voting, and that they were drunk, as the whiskey sign indicates. And Missourians say, well, yeah, what kind of election is it if you're not drunk? And if you're not throwing around a few guns? You know, this is just the way elections are. And they're probably right that what the Missourians did, the election irregularities, are fairly common on the frontier. The elections are filled with alcohol, and they are filled with fist fights and brandishing weapons, and they're filled with voting more than once and shipping voters to the polls where it seems that their votes are needed. So the Missourians probably didn't do anything that wasn't commonly done on the frontier. Their problem is that they overdid it. First of all, they probably didn't need to do it at this election anyway, because they had this commanding demographic lead. It was probably unnecessary in this early election. And a little cheating, nobody would have thought too much about, but they cheated wholesale And that really set off alarm signals, all over the North. What happens then, after this election, first of all, you get a pro-slavery territorial government. The territorial legislature that is elected out of the March 1855 election is going to be pro-slavery. And it's going to write a pro-slavery territorial code, set of laws. They're going to be very draconian in punishments for aiding runaway slaves or even writing abolitionist literature. So we're going to have a pro-slavery territorial legislature. And it is going to be the recognized government of Kansas Territory. And by recognized, I mean it is the government that Franklin Pierce's administration, that later President James Buchanan, territorial government, territorial legislature elected out of the March 1855 election is going to be recognized by the federal government as the legitimate government of Kansas Territory. It isn't, however, going to be recognized by those northern settlers. The March 1855 election is going to galvanize what we call the Free State movement. It's going to create it because northern settlers are going to say, I agreed to this deal. I came to Kansas prepared to vote. You said it would be popular sovereignty. We came to vote, and we were cheated at the elections, and this legislature is a bogus legislature. They will not accept the legitimacy of the territorial government of Kansas. They will say it is a false legislature, a fake one, a bogus legislature. And the March 1855 election will cause these northerners to join in coalition with each other. And what I've got up here, Jim Lane is a former Democratic politician from Indiana, served as a congressman, a one-term congressman from Indiana. He had voted for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Years later, he will say, God forgive me, I voted for it. He'll say, I was taken in. I did not know it was going to be a fraud. But Lane, who is a very charismatic speaker, very shifty fellow, don't let him get it near your pocketbook. Not very trustworthy in a lot of ways, but he's a very charismatic figure and a galvanizing orator, and he is the leader of these Midwesterners who are a big chunk of the northern settlers. Lane and the Midwesterners are going to join in coalition with the New Englanders, led by Charles Robinson. Robinson is a doctor from Massachusetts. He is an agent of the New England Immigrant Aid Company, one of the immigrant aid companies that formed after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, trying to bring New Englanders out to Kansas. Robinson had also been out in the gold rush in California for a while. And Robinson is not quite as charismatic a figure, but he's a very intelligent fellow, a very measured person. If you read his letters, they're filled with great wit. And he doesn't really like Lane. He certainly doesn't trust him. But what's happened is that the New Englanders, who were somewhat more overtly anti-slavery, the New Englanders who tend to migrate singing songs about making Kansas free, and the Midwesterners are mostly coming to get a farm. Jim Lane is famous for having said when he came to Kansas Territory that he would as soon buy a Negro as a mule. This is not a man with any moral compunctions about slavery. But what unites them is that popular sovereignty has been denied them. So this movement that Lane and Robinson helped found and lead, the Free State movement, also called the Topeka movement because it'll be in Topeka, Kansas, that the Free Staters come together and form this movement. This Topeka movement is formed around the basis that popular sovereignty has been denied to them. They were promised a fair vote at the ballot box, and they did not get it. It is not founded overtly on any desire to free the slaves. This is about, as Robinson and Lane would say, 4th of July of 1855. Robinson gives the 4th of July oration in Lawrence, and what Robinson says is that under the Kansas-Nebraska Act, what has happened is that we, by which he means the northern white settlers in Kansas Territory, we have been made the slaves of Missouri. So he's not appealing so much to people's sympathy for black slaves, not appealing on an overtly abolitionist basis. He's saying popular sovereignty was about white men having the right to make this decision, and it has been denied us. I should point out that also part of this Free State Coalition, there are Missourians in it. There are Free State Missourians, people who have moved over into Kansas Territory because they wanted to live in a free state. They didn't want to live in a slave state. Or who joined the Free State movement because they were outraged by what had happened in the ballot box. Summer of 1855, this is the situation that we have in Kansas Territory. We have an elected territorial legislature that is pro-slavery, that is recognized by the federal government as the valid government of Kansas Territory, along with, I should point out, an appointed territorial governor. We also have, however, an extra-legal Free State movement led by Robinson and also Lane that says that it is the legitimate government of Kansas Territory. Because the Free Staters have their own elections. And they write a constitution. There's a document called the Topeka Constitution. And they send it to Congress. They say, admit Kansas as a free state. And Congress does not do that. But they also elect Charles Robinson governor of the state of Kansas. This is 1855, 1856. And Franklin Pierce will call this Free State movement treasonous. We use the word treason connected to what they're doing. So this is an extra-legal movement. Robinson and Lane say our movement, this Topeka government, more closely follows the dictates of popular sovereignty because we are the real people of Kansas, not elected by these fraudulent elections, but they are not recognized by the federal government, and they will be considered treasonous. On the fringes, well, first, in the winter of 1855, the end of 1855, there's an incident near Lawrence called the Wakarusa War that has to do, it starts off as a land claim dispute in which one of the disputants is murdered. And it becomes a political standoff between the Free State and the pro-slavery settlers. And one of the men involved in this dispute takes refuge in Lawrence, fleeing from, he was actually rescued from the sheriff, the pro-slavery sheriff, who is an official of the pro-slavery territorial government, had taken this man prisoner because of his relation to this murder that had occurred. He is liberated by the Free Staters, and he goes in to Lawrence. Oops. Go back. There we go. Map of the kind of border area. So in the winter of 1855, the pro-slavery government is after a fugitive from justice, as they see it, who has been given refuge in Lawrence. Lawrence is the principal Free State settlement. It's named after Amos Lawrence, New England, wealthy New England industrialist who has financed a lot of the New England Immigrant Aid Company and its activities. The sheriff and the territorial government call out the territorial militia, and the territorial militia is augmented by all these Missourians who come over to help. So Lawrence is surrounded in the winter of 1855 by what people in Lawrence, what the New Englanders in Lawrence would have called a mob from Missouri that's threatening the town. Eventually, the territorial governor, an Ohioan by the name of Wilson Shannon, will broker a deal. But in the winter of 1855, Lawrence was very much in fear of being attacked by these Missourians. And the point that I want to make about this Wakarusa War is that it's one of the moments of violence. Some of the settlers, famously, one Free State settler is killed by the Missourians surrounding Lawrence. You start racking up people being killed in what's called Bleeding Kansas. But from a political dimension, what the Wakarusa War shows you is the tensions existing in the territory. Because the Free Staters are defying the authority of the pro-slavery government, of the pro-slavery sheriff who represents that government. They took his prisoner away from him, they gave him refuge in Lawrence, and they're refusing to comply with what the territorial government wants. Turn over the prisoner and turn over their weapons. So it's a very threatening situation here that does not ultimately result in a big outbreak of violence, but it shows you that these tensions between the pro-slavery territorial side and the Free Staters with their extra-legal government has potential for violence. That potential is going to break out in the spring of 1856, with a number of events, one of which Len alluded to, the dispute. Charles Sumner gives his speech that you have in your packet on the floor of the Senate, and he insults a South Carolina senator in the speech, and the senator's nephew is a congressman from South Carolina named Preston Brooks, who comes on to the floor of the Senate and beats Sumner up. So this is the Preston Brooks attack. Brooks attacked Sumner for the things Sumner had said in his crime against Kansas speech about Brooks's uncle, Senator Butler of South Carolina. And you can see the way the North saw this. They saw it as free speech. Sumner is down holding up his pen. His right of free speech against slavery is being attacked by the Southerner. The South saw it as Southern honor, that Sumner had attacked his elderly relative, and Southern honor required Brooks to avenge this insult to the family. Now, of course, under Southern honor, you've been insulted, what do? Okay, you would think you would challenge Sumner to a duel. Except that a duel is for your equal in status. You duel with another gentleman. Sumner's not a gentleman. He's a Northern abolitionist dog. And what you do with a cur is beat it. So that's why Brooks goes for the attack with Kane. Okay, news of this we'll get back. This is May of 1856. News of the attack on Sumner. It's going to inflame the North. It's going to inflame sentiments out in Kansas Territory as well. What's going on also in Kansas Territory is that the pro-slavery sheriff has come back in May of 1856. He's come back to Lawrence to arrest the men who obstructed and took his prisoner away from him last winter. The pro-slavery sheriff, Sheriff Jones, is back at Lawrence to make some arrests. connected to the Wakarusa incident of the winter before. So again, you've brought a posse. My students always snicker when I say posse because now it has new meaning to their generation. But you guys don't snicker, so you're as out of the loop as I am. But the sheriff brings his posse, many of them Missourians, and they proceed to ransack the town. They're unable actually to make any arrests. The Free Staters they're looking for basically get out of town. So the sheriff releases his posse and they ransack the town. The Free Staters will call this the Sack of Lawrence. And this is the hotel that you'll be staying in tomorrow night. Or what was left of the first version of it when the Missourians got done with it. Now the Sack of Lawrence is mostly consists of property damage. Sack brings up these images of burning and pillaging and spitting babies on bayonets. And in fact, the only person who gets killed in the so-called Sack of Lawrence is a Missourian who's standing there when his buddies are ripping the hotel apart and they say, hey, you know, look out, the masonry is falling, and he goes, oh, so not many people are killed, but you won't know this by reading the northern newspapers. The northern newspapers, it's this, hundreds of people have been killed in Lawrence, and then days later you can go in the inside and see the corrections. So it plays into northern propaganda against the democratic policy of popular sovereignty. The attack on Lawrence, the so-called Sack of Lawrence, the attack on Sumner, bring us back to one settler who did care very much about the morality of slavery, John Brown. Brown's a New Englander. He settled in southeastern Kansas, following his sons out to Kansas. Now I want to emphasize, because as you enter Kansas, you're going to hear a lot about John Brown. John Brown didn't have much at all to do with the Free State movement. He didn't vote in his elections. He guarded the polls at one election. He was not in the Free State leadership. He was not involved in the debate over popular sovereignty. He didn't give a damn about popular sovereignty. It was irrelevant to John Brown. What was relevant was that slavery is the greatest sin on the conscience of the United States. A sin that has to be purged. So the Free Staters are very careful. They're not abolitionists. But John Brown is. And he's only peripheral to this Free State movement. But he was on his way. In May of 1856, he was on his way with his sons and parties of men from southeastern Kansas to defend Lawrence against the Missourians who were threatening the town, pro-slavery sheriff and his posse. When they learned en route that Lawrence had already been destroyed, and they appear to have learned en route of what had happened to Sumner as well. And Brown went out that night in late May of 1856. He took a small party of his sons, some of his sons, and son-in-law, and another man to guide them along the creek being Pottawatomie Creek, down in southern Kansas. And they sought out the homes of 3 pro-slavery settlers. They went first to the Doyle house, home of James Doyle, a settler from Tennessee. And this night, knocked on the door. Doyle said, who's out there? They said they were travelers, asking for directions. And Doyle opened the door. Armed men came in. They took Doyle and his 2 oldest sons out by Pottawatomie Creek. Mrs. Doyle waiting in the cabin with the younger children were shot. But she didn't venture out till the morning, and she found the body of her husband and her 2 boys out in the woods, mostly hacked to death. A shot she heard, we think, was put in Doyle's brain after he had already was dead. And we think John Brown fired that shot, but they were hacked to death with swords. Then Brown and his party went to another house, took a man named Alan Wilkinson out, killed him. They went to another house. They were looking for a man by the name of Dutch Henry Sherman, whose store was the headquarters at which a lot of Southern settlers, the 7% of Southern settlers, tended to congregate. They didn't find Dutch Henry, but they found his brother, William Sherman, and they took him out and killed him. So Brown, and I should point out here, James Malin, a Kansas historian in the 1950s, he argued these are not erratic murders, that these men, Malin called this political assassination. Doyle and his sons were involved with the pro-slavery party. They had worked for the territorial court, which of course was affiliated with the pro-slavery government. They had been involved in intimidating free state settlers. Alan Wilkinson was a member of the pro-slavery bogus legislature. And as I said, William Sherman, his brother Dutch Henry, his store was the gathering point for the Georgians, the small Georgia colony that was there. So Malin has said these murders at Potawatomi are not indiscriminate. They're very planned. This is political assassination. This is what Malin has said. And Brown, even though, as I said, he's peripheral to the Free State movement, Free State political movement, what Brown did was take the course of events, essentially seized it out of the hands of Robinson and Lane, and set it off on a new trajectory. After the murders at Potawatomi, the territory dissolves in violence. Order breaks down. You have armed parties of men. Brown is leading one. There are Missouri leaders like Henry Clay Pate. Jim Lane is in fact leading an armed party of men who are going through the territory, shooting at each other, driving out settlers. I quibble with what Len said a little bit. The recent research suggests, not a whole lot of people get killed in Bleeding, Kansas, but a lot of people get frightened. A lot of people are driven out of the territory. There is general panic. People are going back to Missouri in many cases. But what Brown does is to kind of seize, control, or set events off on a different path, into the path of violence and armed conflict, whereas Robinson in particular and Lane have been trying to run this as a political resistance movement. And in fact, Robinson has been very conscious. He doesn't want really armed conflict because he's afraid if the Free Staters resisted by force, the federal government's going to come in. Remember, Franklin Pierce has called them treasonous. If they give the federal government any pretext, the federal government's going to come in and squash them. And to a certain extent, that is, in fact, what happened in the summer of 1856. Robinson was arrested and held in prison. Lane was not in the territory at the time that Robinson was arrested, so he evaded arrest and he was able to lead an armed band of his own. But what the federal government also did, by fall of 1856, the federal government's getting very worried because there's disorder in Kansas. People are running around shooting at each other. They're not hitting each other very much, but it's causing a lot of bad propaganda for the Democratic administration, for President Pierce. And 1856 happens to be a presidential election year. So what Pierce will do is appoint a new territorial governor, John Geary. You see Geary here in his Civil War uniform, but Geary is an Eastern politician, a Democrat. He had been Gold Rush mayor of San Francisco. This is a tough guy. He's also something like 6'4". He's as big as Arnold is, or bigger. He's a big, tough guy, and he came in, and one of the things that Geary did was use the army to round up people on both sides. Geary came down on both sides, and the pressure to submit it for ratification. Let all the settlers, and the Buchanan administration was promising the Free Staters, you'll get a voice in this. We know you didn't participate in the election of delegates, but still, you're going to have a say over whether this becomes your Constitution. Well, what the Constitutional Convention did was they gave the Free Staters, they submitted it for ratification, and the voters of Kansas got to choose between Lecompton with slavery or without slavery. They didn't get a straight up or down vote on Lecompton. They didn't get, yes, Lecompton, no, we don't want Lecompton, throw it out. What they got was a choice between Lecompton with slavery, the territorial government. Now, there's still outliers out there, like John Brown, who has now taken his war against slavery. Things got too hot for him in Kansas. He does come back to the Kansas-Missouri border for a brief while, but as you know, he's going to go out to Virginia and make things hot out there at Harper's Ferry. There are still malcontents, Free State malcontents. Down in southeastern Kansas, around Fort Scott, we have James Montgomery, who's a Free State guerrilla leader, who is stealing ballot boxes and warring with pro-slavery settlers. And Montgomery's actually doing this after the Free Staters control the territorial government. He will actually have people like Charles Robinson wishing he would stop it. Because by 1858, the Free Staters had finally gotten popular sovereignty to work for them. They gained control at the ballot box. They consider people like Montgomery and Brown to be rogues. And after Harper's Ferry, Charles Robinson will say, Brown was at odds with the Free State movement. We wanted to make Kansas a free state through the mechanism of democracy, the ballot box. Brown was fighting his own kind of agenda. So for all that Brown is kind of a symbol, this is the famous mural in the Capitol building at Topeka, all that Brown becomes the kind of famous symbol of bleeding Kansas. It was really people like Robinson and Lane who were the ones who were trying to take popular sovereignty and use it to get Kansas as a free state. And ultimately, they succeeded after 1858. Although it will take until 1861 with when the Southerners secede from the Union and leave Congress, only then can Kansas get the votes to actually come in as a free state. The Free Staters are largely in the control of the territory from 1858 on. Now, final point I want to make is that for all the Free Staters said, they were engaging with popular sovereignty. They just wanted a fair vote under popular sovereignty. This was about the rights of white men to make political decisions about the future of the territory. Ultimately, John Brown, in becoming the symbol of bleeding Kansas, encapsulates something very important that happened during the course of these political events, something very subversive that happened because of these political events. It became an argument about slavery and about the rights of black people. Robinson and Lane said Robinson said the problem is we are slaves of the Missourians. And Lane said we are fighting for white men's liberty. But the fact was that this turmoil in Kansas territory became the opportunity for a lot of Missouri slaves to seize their liberty. During the Civil War itself, Henry Clay Bruce, a Missouri slave who came over into Kansas, like a lot of other Missouri slaves were doing it, and they were starting to do it during the 1850s. They recognized that the political turmoil in Kansas Territory was conducive to advancing black liberty. So, something you're probably not going to talk about on your tour, but 1879, I'm going to leave you with the Exodusters. 1879, when Reconstruction failed in the South, a lot of slaves from the Deep South, Louisiana and Mississippi, decided to get out. They'd been denied their political rights during Reconstruction. They decided to go somewhere else, and where they went was Kansas, because it was the land of John Brown. It was territory made sacred in the name of freedom by this fighting in bleeding Kansas, which they associated with John Brown, the abolitionist, not with Jim Lane and Charles Robinson, who had all these political quarrels about the nature of popular sovereignty and what it meant for white rights. So in a larger sense, bleeding Kansas did become about the anti-slavery moral crusade of the 1800s. Okay, questions? Yes.
I've always thought that John Brown and his band killed the 5 pro-slavery people in Potawatomi Creek, in retaliation of 5 pro-slavery, 5 abolitionists that had been killed. You only mentioned one. I must be mistaken on that.
No.
Black or 9, 5.
No. No, because by that point, I mean, no one had really been killed in the sack of Lawrence, and the one big murder, well, yeah, really there have been 2 high-profile murders of Free Staters. One was the murder that set off the Wakarusa War. One was the murder of a Free State settler in Lawrence, or he was actually leaving Lawrence and trying to go to his farm while the Missourians were surrounding Lawrence in the Wakarusa War. And those had been months earlier. So it wasn't eye for an eye. Yes?
How many people can you document as being killed during the siege of Kansas?
There was an article in Kansas History a few years ago that says about 50. About 50. And then you argue about how to count them, in the sense that you take the murder that set off the Wakarusa War. You count it as a political murder or as a land claim dispute? Well, I would argue it's a land claim dispute that becomes politicized. Yeah.
If I may, just a comment about that. I don't think anyone will ever know how many were killed, 1. But 2, that Dr. Etcheson mentioned, the psychological warfare, and I use that term seriously, you'll hear it more later on, but the psychology of the violence and the terror that is ongoing. I mean, people who came up from the South, from as far away as from South Carolina, Mississippi, and Georgia, they went back. They went back home. Hundreds many who came from the Midwest went back to the Midwest because of the violence and the terror and the psychological warfare, modern term, that is going on. It is just, it's unbelievable. I don't think we've ever quite experienced it other than here.
And in the newspapers, they do play this up. They'll say midnight assassinations. And they do play out the kind of sensationalistic aspect of this.
And, well, going back to the question, Arnold, how many of these people admitted just coming to Kansas to vote with no intention of staying there and just going to go right back home?
Well, that's a very contentious issue. The Free Staters say, and I showed you the slide of the Missourians coming over to vote, Free Staters say these people came over to vote and they have no intention of staying. And one thing that the Missourians would say that I did not mention earlier was that the census was taken in February. And a lot of Missourians would say, well, I intend to come over and settle in the spring, but I'm not going to move over in the winter. I stay over in Missouri with my family, but I intend to come over and be a resident of Kansas, and so I don't want to miss this very important election that will control my destiny once I become a resident. So the Missourians would have said, well, no, on March 30th of 1855, I'm not actually a resident, but I will be in a few weeks. But the Free Staters don't buy that. They say they're just coming to vote and going home. On the reverse side, the Missourians charge that a lot of the Free State voters are being imported by these immigrant aid companies to vote, and then they will be sent home. And probably that's not really happening. What's happening, what the Missourians do see, that Free Staters are coming, northern settlers are coming into Kansas, and they're leaving. And the Missourians say, well, they just came to vote, and then now they're going back to Indiana. Well, what's really happening is people come out from Ohio or Indiana, and they try it on the Kansas frontier, and they go belly up, so they go back. You get discouraged settlers. And Charles Robinson comments on that. They make us look bad, because they make it look like they didn't really come here seriously. You get these Easterners who think, oh, it'd be cool to go out and settle in Kansas and save Kansas for freedom, and they get out there and they're rattlesnakes.
It's cold, it's miserable.
It's cold. Well, it's cold in New England too, but I mean, there are no houses. Charles Robinson's wife, and I don't have a picture of her, but Sarah Robinson, who's one of the great Free State propagandists. She writes a book called Kansas, Its Interior and Exterior Life. And Charles Robinson says she's better known in the East than he is. It goes through zillions of reprints. She hated Kansas. She didn't like it at all. And she was from Massachusetts. They have schools and churches and libraries and civilized people in Massachusetts. And they just got this, dirty, grubby frontier out in Kansas. And she doesn't say that in the book. She talks about the glories of picking wildflowers and the terrible barbarities to be expected from the drunken, whiskey-sodden Missourians. But she was really very unhappy in Kansas and sort of looked down her nose at it. And that's what happens. A lot of settlers come out to Kansas, but they find out it doesn't work for them, and they go back east. You had a question earlier.
Does the number of bona fide residents change substantially from the 4% of Massachusetts in 55 to 57, 58?
No. In fact, 4% is about as high as New England ever gets. It stabilizes at about 2% in the later censuses.
So the immigrant aid societies don't come in and pour in a lot of New Englanders.
No. They get a lot more press, but they really don't produce that many people. Yeah.
What's the reality of beach revivals? The guns provided by the abolitionists? How important was that?
Well, actually, it's kind of funny. Yes, they are raising, what the immigrant aid societies are doing, they are raising money for weapons. Henry Ward Beecher, who's the famous Eastern minister, one of the members of the famous Beecher clan, along with Harriet Beecher Stowe, a novelist. They do send donations of rifles out to Kansas in boxes marked Bibles. In fact, I know Len has the Beecher Bible Church on your itinerary, but there is a church that's called the Beecher Bible Church. Yeah. But they're getting new state-of-the-art Sharps rifles versus the Missourians who had guns, but they don't have the latest, fanciest, newest guns. And that bothers some of the Missourians. But you have all kinds of things being shipped. There's one story of a cannon that they're shipping from the east, and the Free Stater who picks it up over in Missouri, things get shipped into Missouri and then you got to haul them over to Topeka or to Lawrence, and he opens the box up enough to show the wheels and convince the Missourians who's got the cargo that it's a wagon. And he brings it on. And then during the Wakarusa War, one of the other famous stories are the women, Free State women in Lawrence, who smuggle ammunition into Lawrence through this blockade of Missourians by quilting it in their petticoats.
Other questions, comments?
Nicole, what's your bio? Where do you teach?
I teach at Ball State University.
Oh, Indiana.
Yes. Yes. Home of Jim Lennon.
David Letterman.
Well.
David Letterman and Garfield. Jim Davis, who draws Garfield, has his studio outside Muncie.
Really?
Yes. In fact, he gave the address to the Frenchman a week ago.
I'm not that Jim Davis.
Okay.